First, a premise. Any attempt at cultural renewal in matters of art, literature, philosophy, or politics will necessarily come from the right. Our present culture, which I regard as self-evidently degraded, stuck, rotted out, ideologically captured, etc., is also fundamentally leftist in orientation. The implication of this leftist orientation is that any effort that cuts against the prevailing culture will be crudely understood to be of the right. And by the way, as an addendum to this premise, it doesn't matter if you reject this characterization, that you reject that your own art, film, music, architecture, or any other countervailing cultural production is right-wing per se. I suggest that you reject the label anyway for reasons I'll explain below, but it is just a fact of being an outsider, a dissident, a subaltern, which we are, that you do not control the language used to describe you. You do not control the framing and critical evaluation of your work or beliefs. If we did control that language, we wouldn't need to have this conversation. We wouldn't be in a ballroom in Washington, D.C. I had a joke here about Amanda sitting by the pool at the Beverly Wilshire instead. She's not here. Yeah, she maybe, yeah. But the fact is we are waging this battle in the domain of politics, not because we want to, but because we have to, because our circumstances demand it, at least for now. This is all important to understand, namely who we are not the prevailing culture and therefore not of the left, and why we are here and not somewhere else, because it tells us where we are starting from. I'm going to now quote from Nick Land, who elaborates on this point. This comes from a post titled Neo-Reactionary Realism. Again, taking Titus's encouragement here, I'll say that Xenosystems is available now at passage.press. You can use promo code NatCon for free shipping. Yes. So this is a very simple idea, and it may seem perfectly obvious, but it is equally crucial to grasp and take seriously. And now here's the quote. The real problem of political philosophy does not lie in the conceptual effort of modeling an ideal society, but in departing from where we are. The initial real problem is escape. Get to the next page here while you guys marinate on that. Okay. And anyone who understands the nature of path dependence will appreciate this point. You must start where you are at. Any number of us may have a notion of what our preferred society might look like and how it ought to be governed. We may even agree on these points. And I take it to be the primary concern of this conference and the right's intellectual efforts generally to ask the question, where can we get to from here? This is a political question, and it's a perfectly fine question to ask. But unless here is defined, understood, articulated, and mapped out, the question of where to go is just another fantasy. This now brings us around to the question of art and culture. What are we trying to accomplish through art? Firstly, we are trying to describe and map out what it is to be here, what it is to be where we are at. Art has long assumed this purpose. John Ruskin, the great 19th century writer, tells us that art, above our laws, above our accomplishments in science or war or industry, is the most, quote, trustworthy of our civilizational enterprises. As I wrote in the aforementioned article for The American Mind, he says this because art is a naked, intimate act. It is derived from the raw human element. And in fact, art may very well be what at bottom makes us human. It is the sublimation of our deepest biological impulses into creative expression, into beauty, and finally transcendence. At the scale of a population, a people's art is the clearest reflection of that people's way of life, because at its best, it is the clearest reflection of what it is to live, to suffer, to love, to fight, to die, to be. In this way, art holds a mirror up to the world and tells us what is. The left, the mainstream culture broadly, has failed at this because it can no longer or it no longer has the capacity or willingness, if it ever did, to be honest about what is. Instead, its political agenda, where the left wants to go, has overtaken the more fundamental artistic question of what it is to be here. This is an opportunity for the right. This is a void that needs to be filled, and as I began with at the top, it can only be filled by us. But note that delivering on this artistic promise entails stripping out the overtly political element. This is why I caution against producing self-consciously political or right-wing art. It will be called right-wing by the left, and in fact, much worse than that, in order to discredit and demonize anyone who does this successfully. But do not confuse the measure for the target. Getting called a Nazi or fascist may be a sign of our effective artistic production or architectural policy making, but that does not entail setting out to be a Nazi or fascist or trying to provoke such a response. Your art will be right-wing by virtue of telling the truth. What a great place to find ourselves. We don't need to, sure, why not? That deserves an applause. We don't need to rely on tricks, illusions, or fantasies. We just need to be honest. We just need to clearly articulate where we are at. There is a second point to this. Having unreflected on where we are at, there is still the problem of escape, of forward action. How do we orient ourselves so that we can get unstuck? Here's another Land quote. We do not and cannot know what we want any more than we can know what the machines of the next century will be like, because real potentials need to be discovered, not imagined. Consider this pronouncement. I have a dream. This is a nice-sounding pronouncement, but it is the pronouncement of the leftist. It derives from the same epistemic hubris and pretense to social and moral knowledge that gives rise to all forms of utopianism. Stop with utopianism. Stop with the dreaming. Instead, we must ground ourselves in the messy and fragmented world of what is real. Okay. I will try to make this concrete. We are all here today because, presumably, we all reject being absorbed by the totalizing ambitions of a stateless global liberalism. Universalism of this kind is the enemy. Escape from this eventuality is the problem at hand. But what constitutes escape is anyone's guess. National conservatism is a promising possibility, and one I like, but it is only one of many possibilities. If it is true that real potentials are discovered rather than dreamed or imagined into existence, then this implies experimentation. If we knew the answers to our problems already, we'd simply go and implement them. Because we don't know the precise answers, nor how to get unstuck from where we are at, we must hypothesize and test. But sometimes, even hypothesizing is too constrained, and so we must depend on some amount of chaos and randomness to introduce even more possibilities than we would come up with on our own. This is nature's trick with evolution. It's a good trick, and it is also where art might be in service. Outside of the white papers and policy platforms and high-minded political engineering, art introduces the, I will argue, necessary chaotic element into this system of experimentation. Art moves people through emotion, through sub-rational impulse, to act, organize, and arrange themselves personally and socially in ways that political campaigns cannot. But it is chaotic. It is impossible to predict. And as with evolution, the mutations it induces are guaranteed to produce a broad spectrum of consequences, most of which will lead to nowhere at all. This kind of experimentation requires patience. It requires a tolerance for weirdness, for wild strokes of genius, for ambitious failure, and will almost necessarily, at least on occasion, produce outcomes that offend, challenge, and provoke against conservative sensibilities. My final plea, then, is to be less dogmatic and less constrained in what the right, broadly speaking, allows in. I do not mean to advocate for a kind of nihilism or a kind of Dadaism that rejects any and all form and tradition and purpose as a defining feature. That constitutes a constraint and narrowness of possibility all on its own. But rather to identify the people who are aligned, at least on their shared desire for escape, on the question of who we are not, and allow them to bring all available tools to bear on the work of breaking fresh ground and finding a path out from our dead-end situation.